In 1991, while serving as the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, historian Roger Kennedy was shocked to learn, for the first time, that massive ancient city remains existed in North America.
Very, very few of us were conscious of the immensity of a place like Monk's Mound at Cahokia, opposite St. Louis, which is bigger in its footprint than the Great Pyramid at Giza. We didn't know that.
Most Americans have no idea that ancient cities with advanced architectures once dotted the ancient North American landscape. Director Kennedy has since coined a name for such places.
What I call hidden cities. I use the term because these were very big places. There were more people, we now know, in Cahokia, across from St. Louis, than there were in London or Rome. There were major population centers in what are now Nashville and Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and St. Louis.
Why is it that top historians didn't know about such things? And why is it that they are not generally known among the modern public either?
That people are unaware of Hopewell and Cahokia as world-class achievements, of course, UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Not only did Kennedy, as a historian at the Smithsonian, not know about them, at least one president of the Society for American Archaeology had never been to Cahokia, even by the time he retired at the age of 70.
I'm actually one of the people who didn't know all that much about the Hopewell civilization, and in fact, I grew up in the Midwest. I'm from Michigan.
There were tens of thousands of architectural consequences that are now hidden behind our junk and our architectural achievements.
Once I started talking about it, I found lots of other Native people who had no idea that these sites existed and were there and what they were all about and the history of them. That, to me, in and of itself, is amazing, that that level of just silence around this.
We now know more about this silence. We now know that advanced ancient civilizations once inhabited North America, but have become lost to our modern memories, in part because of 19th century political and scientific agendas. Advanced ancient civilizations once inhabited the North American continent, and this fact was common knowledge just 200 years ago.
As Europeans moved northward from the Gulf in the 1530s and westward from Virginia after 1607 and westward from Plymouth Rock in 1620, they did learn that the place had been occupied for a long time by other people. George Washington saw major earthworks. The biggest architecture George Washington ever saw was created by Native Americans along the Ohio River.
They were viewed by the early settlers, of course. They were so plentiful that it wasn't a surprise to have one on your property. These things were common. Oftentimes, many of them were reduced to nothing because they were used for landfill in a growing village or a town or an upcoming city.
Thomas Jefferson was well aware that there were very, very big earthworks in the Ohio Valley, and he became aware, thanks to Lewis and Clark, that there were even bigger ones in the center of the continent around Cahokia and St. Louis.
What were these ancient earthworks? Ancient city walls, buildings, roads, burial sites.
Artifacts of iron were found, artifacts of hardened copper, stone tablets with writing. Regular farmers just plowing their fields would really turn up literally bushel baskets of arrowheads, spear points, etc. And these things were commonplace. But the mounds that we see and the earthen banks and the ditches, to see them in such a great quantity and number, there had to be, just had to be, a very, very large population here at one time.
None of that, virtually none of that, presents itself to us. Yes, in some small park-like enclaves, but downtown St. Louis doesn't have a mound center. Downtown Cincinnati doesn't have a mound center. Downtown Pittsburgh doesn't have a mound center anymore. Marietta is to some extent, Marietta, Ohio, defined by its ancient earthworks, but there's an awful lot that defines it subsequently. So the answer to that is, we don't see it.
Some who authored the very first publications of the Smithsonian, or the earliest books on North American antiquities, described and illustrated things that would surprise most of us today.
Some people, such as Caleb Atwater and Squire and Davis, they believed the artifacts that they were finding around these mounds and cities and earthen structures, that this was representative of an advanced civilization. This is the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution. This is the work that Squire and Davis were able to complete in the late 1830s, the early 1840s, in what's called the Ohio Territory, which primarily worked in the state of Ohio, showing the monuments and the vast cities and the greatness that they must have had.
Some of the sites that they surveyed and the maps that they made, as our only knowledge of these sites even existed now, because they were destroyed or they were intruded upon and their original configurations were greatly altered.
The real question is, why were these sites not preserved? And why are these advanced civilizations not more commonly known of today? The answers can be found in two surprising places. First, in the 19th century implementation of the doctrine of manifest destiny, and second, in the then emerging conflict between evolutionary science and religion.
The three things that really kind of make up manifest destiny, this idea of American exceptionalism. Another idea encapsulated or included in manifest destiny is the ideal that not only are we unique and our institutions are unique, but we have a unique mission to spread that and to take that across the continent. And then the third area is that we are uniquely qualified or called. It is our destiny.
This idea of the different races not only having separate creations, but perhaps they also had different capabilities. That's where that played into it, because it's a small step from there to start talking about allegedly superior or inferior races, and that's exactly what happened.
Science did tell them that there were certain races that were superior and some that were inferior.
There seem to be two traditions in our culture with respect to acknowledging the accomplishments of our predecessors. The first is manifest destiny flowing westward out of New England and New York and Philadelphia. From Plymouth Rock onward, we are fated to progress across the continent, driving the savages before us, and we are going to redeem this place from barbarism.
This classic study on manifest destiny and then Roger Kennedy's application of it to understanding and accepting American antiquities, it's a very obvious pattern.
The obvious pattern was that discoveries of antiquities conflicted with the thinking of European immigrants, that Native Americans and their ancient ancestors were mere savages.
doctrine of manifest destiny allowed the United States government to classify the Native Americans as savages by their terminology, and by calling them savages, that would allow them to push them aside and basically claim their lands as America expanded in a westward direction.
19th century Americans would have found it more than inconvenient. Politically, it would have been impossible for them to have taken lands away from Indians, from any indigenous peoples, if they viewed them as having rights even close to what they had as American citizens.
As the archaeology developed as a new science and anthropology as a new science, and they would find these things, these evidences to show that there was a written language, that these people possibly did smelt iron, they did smelt copper, and they mined it, they carried it, trade over great distances. These were signs of a higher civilization. And that higher civilization idea or theory coming from our educated scientific community of the day became directly in conflict with the manifest destiny ideas put forth by the U.S. government.
Well, it's not surprising to me that Native people in this area at this time were working copper and had extensive knowledge of copper. As an Anishinaabe person who's from Michigan, I can tell you how critical and central copper is to our way of life, even today. With it being so central, of course, we had to be very skilled at mining it and having it be getting resources and sharing those resources and spreading them around. You know, it's not, for me, when I think about it as an archaeologist, it's not just the implements and the level of technology. It's the wider network that would have had to be developed to make that happen. You know, where the copper was coming from, how far away that was, and what I find students are always really surprised by is the extent of those kind of trade networks that we don't see again in this country until much later.
There was every pressure to see the Indians as intellectually inferior and primitive, and a whole set of policies that would keep them from showing that they were as intelligent and could do as well on their own if they had access to capital, if they weren't excluded from the opportunities of other Americans.
I relate to it very strongly as a Native person, and it's this constant idea that Native people's ways of knowing and doing things, it can't possibly have been good. It can't possibly have been as good as these other ways of knowing or these other technologies.
Thankfully, not everyone was persuaded by this interpretation of the doctrine of manifest destiny.
From the very onset, both Catholics and Protestants and non-religious people and Jews, actually, from the very beginning, emphasized the probability that other people had been here before us, that we had to enter into a respectful relationship with them if we were going to learn anything and survive. Indeed, our survival depended upon them.
Sadly, this way of thinking conflicted with prevailing attitudes about Native Americans. Roger Williams, founder of the First Baptist Church in America, in the mid-1600s, believed that indigenous people were not only fellow seekers, but that, quote, the Indians were probably of Jewish descent of the lost tribes of Israel.
You do have missionary efforts, and some of these early missionary-minded folks are very ostracized and marginalized by their society. We see this all the way back in Massachusetts, even with Roger Williams. When he's first run out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he goes and he begins to minister to the Indians, and he's seen as a radical for that.
200 years later, Roger Williams would receive an ally in Mormon church founder Joseph Smith.
Joseph Smith claimed that the Native Americans were, in fact, just like the rest of us. Just as good, just as valuable, and just as important as all of the rest of us.
Later, many other artifacts would turn up that suggested the presence of Middle Eastern cultures in North America.
Protestant priests, Catholic fathers Jewish rabbis were seeing these possible links between the Native Americans and ancient Israel. These links included written records that had possible tie-ins to the ancient world.
There were certainly religious beliefs, thinking that the Native Americans may have been descendants of some Hebraic, Jewish, Israelite travelers to the Americas at different times, or of other Old World peoples at different times. And there are various things fueling these. There were religious, political, and social agendas.
Perhaps the largest documented religious artifact was this ancient city wall mound, recorded in Squire and Davis's Smithsonian publication entitled Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley.
So to see an artifact like that, or the context in which they would place an artifact like that, would be, especially something found in association with the mounds, would be, oh, that shows to us the presence of these people at that time here in the Americas. They were responsible for creating that artifact. They were responsible for creating the mounds and for introducing various cultural aspects into the Americas.
The idea that ancient inhabitants knew of and used Middle Eastern Hebrew symbols undermined the notion that Native Americans were isolated savages. It also conflicted with the emerging science of the day and would mark the beginning of a long-standing controversy.
Morgan followed the idea of English anthropologist of his time, which is the mid-19th century, in thinking that human societies evolved into greater and greater progress towards civilization.
Lewis Henry Morgan, along with Herbert Spencer, would be credited with developing theories of cultural evolution.
Cultural evolution is an interesting way of viewing human cultures. I think we still have some remnants of that with us today, but at the time, people strongly believed that this was how societies came to be, that there was one way to get to the kind of pinnacle of being a human, or the most evolved human. You go through different phases. You start out as a savage, you then learn and experience things through your environment, you work with your technology increases, you become somehow more advanced and move through the stage of barbarism, and then eventually you reach the pinnacle of being an evolved human, which is civilization.
Morgan's theories of cultural evolution labeled Indians as savages and some religious people as barbaric.
That was very racist, but was accepted by just about all the leading intellectuals.
If Morgan influenced the leading intellectuals of the day, what influenced Morgan? Contemporary Presbyterian preacher Charles Finney wrote this, quote, "Outcomes of enthusiastic religion in Western New York feed into the formation of ethnological conceptions for Morgan," unquote. One such outcome was the publication of the Book of Mormon, professed to be translated from the ancient record found in upstate New York by Joseph Smith. Smith claimed that this record had been written in a reformed Egyptian language. Morgan's ethnological conceptions would become the extreme opposite. Natives were not as evolved as those from the Old World. Morgan biographer Leslie A. White would sum up Morgan's views of religion. Quote, "If you were for theology, you were against science, and Morgan was definitely for science," unquote. Still, some modern historians believe that too much has been made of the 19th century conflict between religion and science.
The reality of the ancient American past got caught up to some extent in that set of bickers. The simple-minded controversy between science and religion has contaminated, distorted, and diverted both religion and science.
But people living at the time recognized a huge conflict between science and religion. In 1883, minister and scientist Dr. Stephen Peet, who was a member of 10 archaeological organizations, published one of the most thorough books on the mounds. He claimed that Anthropology had become the battleground for all of the conflicts of thought now going on between revelation and nationalism, faith and skepticism, creation and evolution, etc. Another biographer, Thomas Troutman, would write that Morgan felt, quote, "the monolith of religion must be abandoned," unquote. Morgan's new scientific ideas were shared by fellow New Yorkers E.G. Squire and John Wesley Powell, who would both become highly influential in science and in manifest destiny. Coincidentally, both Powell and Squire's fathers were Methodist ministers in 1830 in Palmyra, New York, and were likely part of the enthusiastic religious climate at the time.
Squire is very interesting. On the one hand, he early in his career, at the time when he's out here surveying and excavating mounds with his partner Edwin Hamilton Davis, he actually defended the intellectual capability of Native Americans. At that point in time, he actually argued that, cultures as diverse as those of Mesoamerica and North America, he said, that people who could invent calendars that were more accurate than those of the Greeks couldn't be said to be intellectually inferior, that, he would defend their capacity to learn. A little bit later in his career, once he had become kind of an agent of, just during his diplomatic career, when he was a U.S. diplomat to Nicaragua, and he then is kind of an agent for American expansion. At that point in time, he's starting to talk about what he thought were these immutable scientific laws, that there were immutable scientific laws that explained the relationship between the races just as there were. So he's beginning to internalize more of this polygynous thought later on, but he sees it having application, so it's kind of a justification for American expansion.
Thus his role as an advocate for the United States expansion seemed to alter his views of the intellectual capacities of Native Americans. Powell, who also embraced these views of Native Americans and the underlying evolutionary ideas, would become one of the most powerful men in American scientific community.
He started the Bureau of Geological Surveys for the U.S. government, and then a spin-off from that was the Bureau of American Ethnology, the anthropology surveys. So his entrepreneur ability led to these two institutions within the Smithsonian, supported by the government, and was a great admirer of Morgan. Morgan also, you see, was an entrepreneur who was very successful. I mean, these are two guys that have a lot in common.
In 1876 in Buffalo, New York, Morgan joined with John Wesley Powell and others in organizing a subsection of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And beginning in 1879, Powell, as Director of Ethnology and Surveys for the Smithsonian, and Morgan, who was the President of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, together created an entirely new direction for the Smithsonian.
There seem to be two traditions at the Smithsonian institutions, and they vie with each other. There's the Lewis Morgan tradition, in which there is a kind of stand on the shoulders of the preceding set of peoples way of looking at life, savagism and semi-barbarism and semi-civilized and civilized and marvelous us. That's one way of looking at life. The other is the tradition that comes from Albert Gallatin, who was really the founder of the Smithsonian Institution, certainly the founder of modern ethnology and anthropology. Gallatin said, no, that's baloney. He called it racism. So there are two traditions. One's linear, and the other is, if not cyclical, respectful.
This new direction would not only include racist ideas, but additionally, it would attempt to limit the use of some artifacts.
I'd like to next read from the following, J.W. Powell's own words. This is a paper that he presented to the members of the Smithsonian at the Bureau of Ethnology, and the title on the talk is On Limitations to Use of Some Anthropological Data, and it's pages 73 through 86 of the 1879 and 1880 book that was published in the Smithsonian. And the quote is as follows: "Hence, it will be seen that it is illegitimate to use any pictographic matter of a date anterior to the discovery of the continent by Columbus for historic purposes.
Native Americans, even today, suffer from this policy, which effectively meant that Native Americans have no history.
You only have history if it's something written down. If you have an oral tradition, that doesn't count as history.
Part of the legitimating the conquest and dispossession and subordination of American First Nations is to disrespect their alternative ways of life, and that would include their systems of recording information.
Many believe that the Native Americans had no written record prior to Christopher Columbus. This would make it prehistory, but nothing could be further from the truth.
What you learn through ceremony has been taught and preserved on birch bark scrolls. Not like English is written in words, but there are pictographs that have been compared to, for example, Egyptian hieroglyphics. We do know that there are certain people who are charged with being the stewards of those scrolls and taking care of them, so they would have closer access to be able to look at and keep those scrolls.
Yet many still believe that Native Americans had no written language.
In fact, on the Department of Natural Resources website, you can see that it says, we have no idea who these mysterious people were who were creating these images. And yet, very clearly, our people, who are the traditional people of that area, we know exactly what those teachings are.
In fact, the Micmac have a written language that predates Columbus.
With a fully developed glyph system, you can say anything, the poetry, philosophy, technology, whatever, as one only has to go to China or Japan to see that their systems are the equal of any European writing system, but very different.
I don't know that everyone running around was creating scrolls and using those in the way we use language today, but it was still something that I think one person could create a scroll and another person would be able to read that had no connection to them.
What happened to these written records?
But it is another irony that we find that we're said to not have any kind of written language or history, and it's all stored in the shelves of the museums.
Every museum, small or big, has a great quantity of stuff that's boxed up that hasn't seen the light of day for literally 100 years.
And we've had the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in this country. You know, in 1978, supposedly we can practice our religion freely. However, our religion is intimately tied with the knowledge that's written on those scrolls, many of which are held in museums that we don't even have. Again, there's this irony of saying no written language, no sophistication, etc., but yet there sure is something that museums want to hold on to.
In fact, artifacts containing what appears to be written language excited great controversy when they were originally discovered. According to the scholarly journal of the Ohio Historical Society, quote, "No subject received more attention or stirred more controversy among archaeologists in the 19th century than the authenticity and presumed meaning of the engraved stone tablets that were periodically recovered from the mounds." Some members of the Ohio Association were among the staunchest defenders of a so-called lost race theory, and many had little doubt that the mound builders were descended from one of the ancient civilizations of Europe or the Middle East, most likely the seafaring Phoenicians of Hebrew or Mediterranean origin. Was the scientific community reacting to these origin ideas? Dr. Stephen Peet may have thought so, and actually charged wanton destruction of the mounds. Whether intentional or not, whether motivated by religious or political agendas or not, modern experts agree that wanton destruction did occur.
Manifest destiny, the idea that American First Nations have never achieved anything worth preserving, has resulted in the wanton destruction of thousands and thousands of earth constructions, mounds, embankments, figures, and settlements. So we have lost incalculable amount of archaeological data because of no appreciation of their value for historical purposes.
I think the origins of our pattern of obliteration and ignorance of the past of ancient America lies in two ways. First, we thought as a nation that we were starting something brand new. Our founding documents are full of new start, new page, new everything, new order of the universe, we say in our national sale.
Powell had become a national hero for exploring part of this new land, the treacherous Colorado River. But what he is not as well known for was his defining of the origin and evolution of Native Americans.
He was more interested in putting to rest what he called a mound builder myth, the idea that these mounds had not been built by the prehistoric ancestors of North American Indians. There were some people who were arguing that the mounds had not been built by any of the existing groups of North American Indians, and they would use the word race indiscriminately. There were others who did argue that no, these were non-Indian peoples in a biological sense, and that they were built by Europeans. But Powell was what Powell really wanted to do. He had a research agenda at the Bureau of American Ethnology, and that was he wanted to unite archaeology and ethnology in the common study of American Indian. So what Powell wanted to do was break that idea down that that archaeology and ethnology, in other words, studying living cultures of North American Indians, and then studying them on their own terms, documenting as they exist now, but also then looking at archaeology not as studying the record of some exotic European culture that was once here, but looking at archaeology in light of ethnology, that this was an earlier stage of existence among North American Indians.
The Powell agenda forced artifacts to be viewed only through the lens of currently observable savage Indian culture. Was this an artificial barrier to science?
We would say that's bad science, where you want to discount information because it kind of doesn't fit what you think you see. And what you think you see is, of course, all informed by all these theories and ideas and what you've been told. And what you see is what people saw at the time were these savages who were in this pitiful state.
Powell's vision of 19th century evolution was that Native Americans had evolved in North America for millions of years to a state less advanced than that of European immigrants. Robbing Native Americans of their history before Columbus may have served two purposes. First, justifying manifest destiny and the displacement of Native Americans. And second, dismissing of popular religious ideas that ancient Native Americans may have had Middle Eastern origins, and thus rights equal to those of European immigrants. Powell wrote, "Whether we desire it or not, the ancient inhabitants of this country must be lost, and we may comfort ourselves in the reflection that they are not destroyed, but are gradually absorbed and become part of a more civilized community."
So when that's what your framework is, of course then it makes sense in a way, as troubling as it is, and the racism really that we're talking about is so deep there. It does make sense that that's your worldview. That's what you've been told. So none of this data fits. Rather than looking all of the data and trying to determine what story can we put together, what can we understand from this data, I think that's what happened. I think very clearly people were willing to discount things that didn't fit what they could see, which was Native people in this, pitiful, savage, wild state as they were viewed by Europeans.
Thankfully, some artifacts in ancient cities yet remain, such as these once city walls intentionally preserved as mounds in a golf course in Newark, Ohio.
I'm standing here at the parallel walls that connect the gigantic octagon with a large circle. The circle is 1,054 feet in diameter. The octagon encloses 50 acres, which is large enough to encompass 4 Roman colosseums. This was built by the ancient Hopewell culture that lived in this region between about 100 BC and AD 400.
The level of precision, it is incredible.
The entire Newark earthworks encompasses 4.5 square miles, and it was the largest complex of geometric earthworks ever built in the world. It includes 2 circles, a gigantic octagon, a square. Actually, what we call the Hopewell culture, things like it at least, and things related to it, covered much of eastern North America in different parts. As far south as Florida, as far west as Kansas City, as far east as perhaps New York.
They had to be incredibly sophisticated to be able to build these mounds perfectly, in unison to an octagon shape and a circular shape.
It's clear that they rival, by any scale, any other cultural achievement in the world. The Great Pyramids, the Great Wall of China, the Roman Colosseum.
I'm not that surprised by it. There's so many other things that we see when we start learning about and looking into Native culture that I think people on the surface may be surprised, because they tend to think of Indian people as anti-intellectual or, non-scientific, or somehow, living in the backwoods and not knowledgeable about things like that.
The knowledge embedded in these earthworks and encoded in their structure is anything but primitive. It's remarkable.
It also shows that not just high math, but these sites are lined up primarily with the lunar calendar. They had high math, they understood geometry, and because of the lunar calendar, they also understood the heavens, astronomy.
What I've learned now is just how amazing they were in terms of their knowledge of the solar system and of mathematics.
And then they had the unit of measurement was 606, which they call the stade. One side of the Great Pyramid from the base to the tip of the apex is 606 feet. If you square inside the octagon, which the surveyors like to call, it's a term they use, squaring the circle, and you divide that up into 4 equal parts inside of cubes, you'll find those cubes are all made of 606-foot lines per cube side. The angle of the Great Pyramid of Egypt runs 51.8 degrees up the slope from the base to the angle. That measurement is there, and when you come off of the baseline at Newark and you run true north and then measure that angle back to the baseline, what do we find? 51.8 degrees. So did they have the same math as the ancient Egyptians? Well, I gotta say, yeah, it sure looks like it.
It's as inspiring, I think, in its way as the NASA program to send a man to the moon.
And what a special place it is. You feel that right away. You feel it immediately when you're there. I was in a kind of strange position because I was on a job interview when they took me to the site, and I was literally just from the presence of the place moved to tears and felt kind of uncomfortable as a person in a job interview, but yet having these strong emotional feelings and some connection to this place and the history that was there. And it just occurred to me, how could this be?
The people who created the settled places, the agriculture, the urban design, the engineering, and the astronomy that preceded us, preceded we European Americans, are not quite us. They are other people, we felt. And in the European American tradition, there's a long, long history of our saying to ourselves, oh, no, that's those people. And those people can't be as good as us people. They couldn't have built those great big things.
Have these traditions affected our scientific thinking? Did we, because of cultural biases, fail to recognize the advanced nature of ancient mounds and artifacts?
The presuppositions that scientists go into the field with comes out of our cultural tradition. If you want to earn a living as an archaeologist in a university setting with the opportunity to teach and some support in publishing, you have to not challenge the senior people openly. And depending on the department, of course, there may be more or less egotistical senior people. It's like the chute in a corral, and the animals are basically trapped. They can't go sideways, they just go through the chutes. You know, you can think of that as academic employment.
While not everyone in academia may agree with this position, if true, it may also be true that Lewis Henry Morgan and John Wesley Powell, in their time, helped to build the corrals of appropriate professional archaeological thought, casting doubt on many archaeological artifacts dating before Columbus as avocational, amateurish, and therefore questionable. Historian Barnhart disagrees with this notion.
But they were avocational in the true sense of the word, is that there was no professional archaeology at that time. There were no specialized journals of archaeology. There were no specialized conferences. That begins to happen in the late 19th century. But at that time, archaeology had no professional or institutional setting, and it was really done by a lot of talented amateurs in the true sense of the word.
As archaeology became institutionalized, a greater division would form between mainstream scientists and amateur archaeologists who continued to accept artifacts that were purportedly pre-Columbian and that might suggest the presence of cultures from other parts of the world. This latter group are known today as diffusionists. Diffusionists are scholars and amateur archaeologists who believe that contact between inhabitants of America and other geographies may have taken place before Christopher Columbus. Most scholars featured in this film believe that the ancestors of today's Native Americans came to North America across a land bridge that had formed during the Ice Age. With perhaps only one exception by the Vikings, no outside contact with Native Americans prior to Christopher Columbus is believed to have occurred. Diffusionists, on the other hand, believe that ancient Native Americans, such as the Hopewell civilization, might have traded, intermingled, or even originated from other cultures. A controversy surrounding artifacts found at the Newark, Ohio earthworks demonstrates the division between some diffusionists and most mainstream archaeologists.
This is one of the earliest maps that we found on the Newark earthworks. This is a drawing by Wyrick from 1860.
David Wyrick had done the first comprehensive surveys of the magnificent Newark earthworks. The first of what came to be known as the Holy Stones was found there, and 5 months later, at the Jacksontown Stone Mound a few miles southeast of Newark, he found something even more amazing.
They found one major earth structure in the center, surrounded by 12 small burials. David Wyrick went straight for the middle one with 9 other gentlemen, and they began to dig that mound down. And they uncovered it. When they did, they found a wooden coffin made out of oak. And opening up that coffin, in there was a large skeleton of a man, but also in this coffin was a little box, no more than maybe about 8 or 10 inches in size, and it was cemented shut. Wyrick and the men, while they're all there together, they pried this box apart, and in it was a black stone. They opened this box, and here was this unusual artifact.
We own the Newark Holy Stones, and these stones were found in a Hopewell mound in the 1860s, and the presumption from finding them was that perhaps the American Indians had some kind of contact with the Hebrews, or possibly they were the Hebrews. That's another idea. So we have the museum has been interested in origins.
They took it to some scholars, identified that it was probably some type of Hebrew. They took it to some rabbis living in the area, and upon looking at it, they said yes, they could read it. And it was a complete rendition of the 10 Commandments. They called it block Hebrew because they had never seen anything written like this, but they called it block Hebrew. And so then naysayers started picking on Wyrick. He was accused of sticking this stone in front of these 9 men somehow, and being able to hide it and conceal it.
Upon examination, mainstream archaeologists proclaimed the stones a hoax, while many diffusionists continue to believe in their authenticity.
There has been good points on either side for whether they are a first millennium piece of artifact or something that was devised in the 19th century.
And then it wasn't until sometime in the 1900s, lo and behold, in Israel, they find, guess what? They found block-style Hebrew. That block-style Hebrew was given a name by the experts, monumental Hebrew, because of the way it was written. Long after Weyrich. After.
Mainstream archaeologists dismiss such findings, in part because scientific protocols and rules of evidence were not followed in their acquisition.
The science of archaeology was really in its infancy at that time. There were only a few people using what we would consider to be even remotely modern methods.
But what of the tens of thousands of artifacts found prior to the establishment of these modern methods? Should we ignore these artifacts because they have been irreversibly separated from their original surroundings? But diffusionists like to point to one artifact that has been dismissed by mainstream archaeologists, even though it was found using modern methods within the original surroundings.
They can't say that about the Bat Creek stone because the Bat Creek stone was found in the course of an official excavation by the Smithsonian Institution. Okay, then Bat Creek stone went to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. They didn't understand it. They thought it was Cherokee since it came from Cherokee country. They did not realize it was Hebrew. And they published it upside down, and then they threw it in a box in the sub-basement of the Smithsonian. And ever after it was poo-pooed until some Semitic scholars like Cyrus Gordon came and vindicated it.
Cyrus Gordon, who was one of the great Semitic scholars of our generation, he talks about the writings that were found in this very area and how he was able to translate those things, translate that writing. When it was turned over, they were trying to figure out what type of Native American wrote this, and Cyrus Gordon turned it upside down. He recognized that it was actually Phoenician.
Phoenician, this older form of Hebrew, dates to the Old Testament Babylonian captivity and the scattering of Israel. Are there other linguistic evidences that may lend support to diffusionist ideas?
As a scholar of ancient languages, I have discovered that there are many symbols in the Micmac that are very close and similar to those of ancient Egyptian. About 700 BC in Egypt, there was a language that was developed or came in that was called Meroitic from the kingdom of Meroe, which many Egyptian scholars have even called Reformed Egyptian because it's so different than what the standard Egyptian that we know. And this Meroitic is very close to some of the signs of the Micmac.
Anthropologists dismiss a lot of the stone evidence and inscriptions in these ancient languages like Egyptian and Greek and Hebrew by saying, well, they were not found in the course of an official excavation.
Are these diffusionist ideas simply a continuation of the controversies that existed in John Wesley Powell's day?
There were some people who were arguing that the mounds had not been built by any of the existing groups of North American Indians, and they would use the word race indiscriminately. There were others who did argue that no, these were non-Indian peoples in a biological sense and that they were built by Europeans.
Perhaps DNA science can settle once and for all the biological question of who, for example, the Hopewell mound builders were.
We can use DNA to help us reconstruct the past and the history of different populations because your DNA is passed down from your parents from generation to generation. There are certain types of DNA in particular that are very useful for reconstructing population prehistory. Your mitochondrial DNA is DNA that every person has, and you inherit it from your mother. Your mother passes it on to her children. Men don't pass it on to their children. And this type of DNA, therefore, gives us a measure of matrilineal relatedness. I collected DNA from and analyzed DNA from a couple of different Hopewell cemetery populations. When we looked at DNA from these two different Hopewell populations from Illinois and Ohio, we found that there were 5 primary mitochondrial DNA lineages present. These lineages have become designated by letter names in the scientific world, and the ones that we see in Native American populations, both living today and in these Hopewell cemeteries, were the mitochondrial lineages A, B, C, D, and X. And these 5 lineages are ones that are common today in Native Americans, and they were the ones that were present in these ancient Hopewell communities. When we look at the distribution of haplogroup X in the Americas, we see that it's present in about 3% of all Native Americans, but it's more common in some populations. In particular, peoples who live in the upper Great Plains exhibit much higher frequencies of haplogroup X, sometimes up to 25 or 30 or even 50% in some samples that have been studied. This research, the genetic research that we've done, really conclusively proves that the same mitochondrial lineages are present in ancient Hopewell burial populations as we see in contemporary Native American populations. And that very clearly establishes the relationship between these contemporary Native American populations and the ancient Hopewell.
DNA science apparently settles the biological questions of who these ancient, advanced Hopewell mound builders were. But where else is this DNA found? And where did it originate?
The form of haplogroup X that's present in the Americas is known as haplogroup X2A. And this specific type is defined by a number of additional mutations that Native Americans who belong to haplogroup X share. This particular form of haplogroup X is not found in Europe. In fact, it's not found, as far as we know at this point in time, anywhere in Europe or Asia. But in particular, there's no recent connection to Europe and to European individuals who possess haplogroup X. The only similarities that we see are similarities that stem from much more distant, much more ancient ancestry that probably dates back 30,000, 40,000 years, perhaps somewhere in the Near East. And so what most likely happened is that this very ancient common ancestor of individuals who belong to haplogroup X had descendants who split and went 2 different directions. Probably some of these individuals moved to Europe, others moved towards Asia and up towards Beringia. And it appears that this Asian form of haplogroup X is what eventually made its way into the Americas. There have been some recent studies that have suggested that this particular distribution of haplogroup X in the Americas is most consistent with a migration from Asia through the Bering Strait over the land bridge and then down through the ice-free corridor. And so if individuals with haplogroup X migrated through that ice-free corridor, they would have first entered the continental United States and continental North America in the upper Great Plains, and it would make sense then that we would see the highest frequency of haplogroup X today in populations in that region.
Most mainstream archaeologists and historians would probably agree that this assessment is something of a contemporary final word on Native American origins. So does DNA science put much of diffusionist theory to rest? Diffusionists would answer no. The reason? There's a lot about DNA evidence that is a controversy.
I'm Cherokee Indian, and so I had a moral imperative to investigate my own family history and origins, and that led me to DNA. I was a professor at that time in Georgia, and with my research partner, Dr. Elizabeth Hirschman, we became interested in the mystery of our people. Haplogroup X is really a fascinating story because the X-Files of Native American genetics, because it burst on the scene in 1998. Scientists didn't want to believe it, but they found a new haplogroup in addition to A, B, C, D among the Indians of the Great Lakes in particular. And that was haplogroup X. And so immediately the scientists who have a kind of idée fixe, in my opinion, set about trying to find haplogroup X in Mongolia and Siberia, because of course all American Indians, all upstanding American Indians came across the Bering Land Bridge chasing woolly mammoths, right? So they weren't able to find haplogroup X in Siberia. They found one case of it. That wasn't enough. Haplogroup X was a Eurasian type. So then they started talking about, oh, well, maybe they got here by jumping across the ice in a circumpolar fashion. Okay. Well, it kind of rested there for a while. As it turned, and last year, finally, the mystery of haplogroup X was revealed in a very important study by a team under Dr. Schluss, and he determined without any doubt that the origin of haplogroup X was the hills of Galilee. It was that clear. That's where, because where you have the greatest concentration and the greatest diversity, you have, that's the origin.
There's no controversy among DNA experts about the Middle Eastern origin of haplogroup X. The only question really is, when did it arrive in the Americas?
Most projections about ancient human history, prehistory really, are based on a mathematical and statistical model called phylogenetics.
What we find in the journals is that it is commonly thought among DNA experts that there was an outmigration of haplogroup X from the Middle East about 40,000 years ago.
That's a pure projection. You know, it's a mathematical progression going back to there based on how mitochondrial DNA mutates. Is it true? Who knows?
But what most people don't realize is that among these same experts in these same journals, there is controversy about the dating.
So, you know, I think these are projections.
The controversy is between those who assume a theory that man branched from chimps 5 to 6 million years ago versus those who are using newer actual findings from DNA pedigree studies. The theoretical dating gives much longer time frames, but the actual data shows a 20-fold reduction and would place the Middle Eastern outmigration of haplogroup X about 2,000 years ago, plus or minus.
Is it true that all Native Americans came from 10 families that stumbled across the Bering Strait chasing woolly mammoths before the last ice age? I don't think mine did.
Whether or not ancestors of Native Americans originally came from Asia over the ancient land bridge, or whether or not they had interactions with other parts of the world, one thing is clear: much of their archaeological record is now gone.
It is unfortunate there was such an opportunity there, and I don't think that people consciously were trying to destroy things or ignore things. I think that for me this was a case where, you know, expansion was the thing on everyone's mind and moving forward.
Victims of science and of the doctrine of manifest destiny, 19th century Native Americans were labeled as savages, and this helped to legitimize their suppression, subordination, and the taking of their lands.
The idea that manifest destiny trumped all is certainly, as far as I have been able to read, absolutely true.
I understand that these early scientists were in the kind of products of their time, in that that's what people were talking about and that's what they were saying, and so they believed that yes, in fact, you know, Native people are savages who we can clearly see that. That's what they were thinking.
Disregard of their value resulted in the wanton destruction of thousands of artifacts and grand architectural achievements, and aided in erasing knowledge of their advanced capabilities from our collective memories. While scholars may disagree on the interpretation of remaining evidences, these remaining archaeological evidences may be keys to eventually recovering and more fully appreciating the buried history and culture of these ancient, lost civilizations.
I think it's important that we pay attention to the achievements of our predecessors. We may respect our predecessors a little more if we do. We certainly will respect our own responsibilities a little more if we look at the evidence that over the preceding 9,000 to 10,000 years, there have been several other periods in which, I'm assuming, proud people did proud things in the landscape and in cities. So there are important things for us to learn.